When I first came to the US in '96, I asked an American journalist, so what's the response going to be to me as a black man from Britain? And he said, well, when they hear your voice, they'll add 20 points to your IQ. Oh, that's good. And he said, but when they see your face, they won't. And I figured that given that even with the bell curve, you know, those racists, Charles Murray and so on, who decided that all black people are 10 points more stupid than white people, even if you took their rationale into account, I would still be 10 points up on where I left in Britain. And I've needed those 10 points over the last couple of weeks, in particular as I've been talking about my book and the speech, because of the desire that there is in this country, not that this particular desire would necessarily be exclusive to this country, but in this moment, to wrap Martin Luther King in the American flag, to make the March on Washington not a massive moment of multiracial dissidence, but a great patriotic desire, as though everybody wanted this, and it was inevitable what the outcome would be, that this was as beautiful a moment as it looks now that it was then, that this is part of America's relentless charge towards progress. And people saying things like, do you think that King's dream has been realized? I think, well, I think if he came back and looked to the jails, and looked to the schools, and looked to the unemployment lines, and the mental health institutions, and the universities, and the places of privilege, I think it's unlikely that King would think my work here was done. And then they say, well, do you think Obama is the embodiment of King's dream? I think, well, I don't remember King ever dreaming about a single person. And King was a pacifist. He had a dream, Obama has a drone. That doesn't mean that Obama couldn't fit somewhere in King's worldview. I'm sure, like most African Americans, he would have been pleased on the night when he was elected, but the notion that somehow it would be an embodiment of his dream kind of seems crazy to me. And the second day that I was in the country, after I'd been warned that I would have these 10 points on my IQ, I sat at the Washington Mall on Independence Day, and there was they were playing quotes from great Americans. And the first came from Reagan. I think it was President Gorbachev ripped down this Berlin Wall, and the crowd cheered. And then the next was King from I Have a Dream speech, and the crowd cheered. It was the same crowd. I looked around, it looked like the same people cheering, and I thought, what am I not getting here? What don't I understand? And since that moment, I've been intrigued by how apparently versatile this speech can be. How many people feel that they have a right to interpret it as they will. Of course, we all have a right to interpret it as we will, but that to see Glenn Beck, when he has his march restoring honor, do it on the anniversary of the Dream speech and mention him King by name, to claim King. To see Ronald Reagan, who as recently as '83 said, when asked, do you think King was a communist, said, we'll have to wait 35 years to find out, won't we? At a different point, claim King as an opponent of affirmative action. To see Obama take the nomination, the Democratic nomination in 2008, on the anniversary, which couldn't have been an accident, and then not to mention King by name, which also could not have been an accident. I think there is something intriguing going on here about how the country does or doesn't understand him and that moment. Now, there's an African proverb that I'm sure some of you are aware, that only when the lions get to write history will hunters cease to be the heroes. And what I'm hoping is tonight, myself and the panelists that I'm with are going to act as lions tonight and look at this history from a different angle. Now, the first thing I think that's important to know about, an important way to understand this speech is that, of course, it's one man giving a speech. And yet this speech comes out of the efforts and sacrifices and militancy of tens of thousands of people. That the speech only has meaning because of its timeliness and its timelessness. And so the timeliness speaks to the specific moment in which it was delivered and how and why it struck a chord. But the timelessness, my parents came to Britain from Barbados. That's where I came from Barbados to Britain. That's where I was born. I grew up with this speech in Britain. I did it at school when I was about 12 in a town just outside of London. I remember reporting a story about gypsies in the Czech Republic, and halfway into a bottle of vodka, the man that I was talking to was saying, "We need a dream, we need our Martin Luther King." That this is a global speech. And so the other question that I've often been asked, which does feel a bit like the Muslim guy who was asked, "Why are you writing a book on Christianity?" is, "You're English. You know, what rights do you have to this speech?" Well, I don't have any rights to this speech. The only person who really has rights to this speech are the King estate. But beyond that, this is a global speech, and it speaks to a global moment. And so I want to first read from the book about the moment that produces this energy. And I start with an interview I did with Franklin McCain, who was on February the 1st, 1960, 17-year-old Franklin McCain and 3 black friends went to the whites-only counter at Woolworths in Greensboro, North Carolina, and took a seat. "We wanted to go beyond what our parents had done," McCain told me. "The worst thing that could happen was that the Ku Klux Klan could kill us, but I had no concern for my personal safety. The day I sat at that counter, I had the most tremendous feeling of elation and celebration," he told me. It also told me that he'd been raised with a lie. His parents had told him that he could do and be whatever he wanted to be. And at 17, he realized this was not true as a black man growing up in North Carolina. And so he'd contemplated suicide at that young age, and which was why the threat of what might happen if he sat down at this Woolworths didn't really impact him. He said, "I felt that in this life, when I sat there, nothing else mattered. If there's a heaven, I got there for a few minutes. I just felt you can't touch me, you can't hurt me, and there's been no other experience like it, not even the birth of my firstborn son." A few years later in Birmingham, in May '63, a burly white police officer attempted to intimidate some black schoolchildren to keep them from joining the growing anti-segregation protests. They assured him they knew what they were doing, ignored his entreaties, and continued their march through Kelly Ingram Park, where they were arrested. A reporter asked one of them her age. 6, she said, and then she climbed into the paddy wagon. The following month in Mississippi, Fannie Lou Hamer overheard Anel Ponder, a fellow campaigner, being beaten in an adjacent jail cell. "Can you say yes, sir, nigger? Can you say yes, sir?" the policeman demanded. "Yes, I can," replied the protester. "So say it." "I don't know you well enough," said Ponder. And then Hamer heard her head hit the floor again. The torture continued like this for some time, with Ponder praying for God to forgive her tormentors. All books about all revolutions begin with a chapter that describes the decay of tottering authority or the misery and sufferings of the people, wrote the Polish journalist Ryszard Kapuscinski. But they should begin with a psychological chapter, one that shows how a harassed, terrified man suddenly breaks his terror, stops being afraid, And this unusual process demands illumination. Man gets rid of fear and feels free. The period preceding Martin Luther King's speech at the March on Washington was one such chapter. Until that point, there had, of course, been many fearless acts by anti-racist protesters, but in that moment, the number who were prepared to commit them reached a critical mass. In May '63, the New York Times published more stories about civil rights in 2 weeks than it had in the previous 2 years. According to the Justice Department, during the 10-week period following Kennedy's national address on civil rights in June, which was shortly before King's speech, there were 750 demonstrations in 186 cities, resulting in 14,733 arrests in 10 weeks. And such were the conditions that made the March on Washington possible and King's speech so resonant. The context was global. 2 weeks after McCain made his protest in Greensboro, the British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan addressed the South African Parliament in Cape Town with an ominous warning. The wind of change is blowing through this continent, he said, and whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact. Now, his immediate audience, the apartheid government in South Africa, did not like that at all. But as the decade wore on, that wind became a gale. In the 3 years between Macmillan's speech and the March on Washington, the following countries became independent: Togo, Mali, Senegal, Zaire, Somalia, Benin, Niger, Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, Chad, Central African Republic, Congo, Gabon, Nigeria, Mauritania, Sierra Leone, Tanganyika, and Jamaica. Internationally, non-racial democracy and black enfranchisement that came with it were the order of the day. The longer America practiced legal segregation, the more it looked like a slum on the wrong side of history rather than the shining city on a hill. Now, the civil rights protesters wanted to force a crisis. That was their aim. James Farmer said, we're going to force a crisis so the federal government has to intervene to protect our constitutional rights. This is how Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci describes a crisis. He says, the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. Now, until the summer of '63, when King delivered his speech, even though the health of the old segregated polity in the South was clearly failing, the birth of a new integrated one had yet to be induced. Eventually, the Kennedy administration was forced to play midwife because it had no choice. By the time of the March on Washington, the civil rights movement had raised acute questions of power. Who has it? Who wants it? How do you get it? How do you keep it? And the answers would be delivered in a blunted fashions. Governors personally blocked schoolhouse doors. Cities were put under martial law. National Guard troops were federalized and dispatched. Children filled jails. Protesters were killed. In short, the fundamental ability and right of the state to maintain law and order became an open question, assaulted at every turn from all directions. Now, in the South, segregation and the white supremacy that came with it had been the norm for more than 2 centuries, with a brief break during Reconstruction after the Civil War. And while it had always been resisted, generations of both blacks and whites, not to mention officials, both federal and local, had grown accustomed to it. James Kilpatrick, the editor of The New Leader of Richmond, wrote, "Who hears a clock tick or the surf murmur or the trains pass? Not those who live by the clock or the sea or the track. In the South, the acceptance of racial separation begins at the cradle. What rational man imagines the concept can be shattered overnight?" But now the status quo was openly challenged and brutally defended. Long-held allegiances were tested and positions polarized. Key players who learned to live with segregation, federal government, business, liberal whites, conservative blacks, were forced to reckon with the arrival of a new order. And fissures opened up, not just between these various interested parties, but also within them as events tested their ability to accommodate, negotiate, and confront this impending transformation, drawing sharp distinctions at each juncture between those who ostensibly held power and those who actually wielded influence. Now, that distinction would become very, very sharp with the civil rights movement, because pretty much after Birmingham, at each moment during that year, they were being tested by their base, that the grassroots were running faster, demanding more, becoming more impatient than the established civil rights movement could offer. In June of that year, King spoke in Harlem and was heckled by some in the crowd shouting, "We want Malcolm." And that was the fear of the civil rights movement, that we may lose control of this moment. And it was also the fear of the Kennedy administration, that they may lose control. And it was also the fear of the established supporters of segregation, that they may lose control of the Klan and others. I mean, nobody could really control George Wallace, though many tried. And that really set the scene for the march, because at the beginning of that year, nobody wanted a march in Washington. CORE and SNCC, the radicals, the young radicals who were in the field, they wanted a march on Washington. They wanted to snarl up the traffic, get in the congressmen's faces, and really kind of not turn the place upside down, not ransack it, but creative civil disobedience. The Urban League was worried about its non-profit status. The NAACP was keen to have a conference at which Kennedy would speak, and they thought that a march was just going to be a show, and they didn't see how it would help. And King, you could see the point, but it wasn't urgent to him. He didn't. It wasn't something that he argued for. He was prepared to listen to Randolph's case for it, A. Philip Randolph, but he wasn't that keen. And then Birmingham came. And so this march that was an orphan suddenly had many parents to claim it. And the person who was designated to lead this march, or to organize this march, at a very late hour, and for this we must bear in mind, marches on Washington at that time weren't a big thing. I mean, now we do marches on Washington kind of somewhat regularly, but this was the first of its kind. I mean, not that other people hadn't tried marches, but not huge marches. They were talking about 100,000 people. That's how many they wanted. Nothing of that scale had ever been tried in Washington. They really committed to it sometime after Birmingham, so we're talking about late May, early June. And there was only really one man that could do the job, and that was Bayard Rustin. Now, Bayard Rustin was a fantastic figure who is all too easily forgotten in these stories, although his reputation is enjoying a revival. And he was, like most, I think, amazing black people in history, he was a man who did not know his place. And because he did not know his place, he was able to do as he wished. He was an out gay man, a pacifist, a conscientious objector, a former member of the Communist Party, a brilliant organizer and a brilliant theoretician. And the head of the NAACP certainly said, "You cannot run this march. You're a liability." And A. Philip Randolph, trade unionist and socialist, and really the elder in this moment, said, "It's my march," because he called it. He'd actually called one in 1941, and then he'd called it off when FDR had made his concessions, and here he was again. He said, "All I ask is that I get to choose who will be my deputy." And they said, "Okay." And then he said, "Okay, I choose Bayard Rustin." And so, with A. Philip Randolph outmaneuvering them, he gets Rustin. Rustin sets up this HQ in Harlem. And it's full of young people who are just working round the clock to make this happen. I spoke to Rachel Horowitz, who organized the transport, and she said, you have to remember there's no email, there's none of that. We're doing everything in duplicate and triplicate. We're phoning people. You know, it was bedlam. People sleeping in the office and waking up, and that was all they were doing. And what starts with A. Philip Randolph and what was started as a march for jobs, after Birmingham becomes a march for jobs and freedom, and a coalition builds of the unions and the civil rights movement, but then it grows as church groups get involved. And I just want to read this short bit from the march planning headquarters. So one gets the sense that this was, while it was a massive act of dissidence, it was also a strategic intervention. As the coalition supporting the march grew, so the leaders' appetite for the more militant proposals for the event, like disrupting traffic and mass civil disobedience, diminished. Among other things, they abandoned plans to give a prominent speaker slot to an unemployed worker and to march around the White House. Back in Harlem, each time Rustin announced yet another radical element had been dropped, his young staff would berate him. We'd shout, "Oh, Bayard, you're turning it into a circus. This is such a sellout," Horowitz told me with a laugh. Vincent Harding, an activist and close friend of King's at the time, didn't bother making the trip to the march. He said, "There was a certain hard-headedness among some of us at the time. We were interested in a march on Washington. When it became a march in Washington, we lost interest." But ever the coalition builder, Rustin explained to the young campaigners, "What you have to understand is that the march will succeed if it gets 100,000 people, or 150, or 200,000, or more." And it did get more, got 250,000. To show up in Washington, it will be the biggest rally in history. It will show the black community united as never before, united also with whites from labor and the churches from all over the country. But there was one thing that Bayard Rustin would not allow. The one line that he drew was that no politicians will speak from the stage. And that was one interesting distinction between the march that was held on Saturday and this one where Eric Holder got 30 minutes and Nancy Pelosi spoke, that Rustin said that they're here to listen to us. We're not here to listen to them. And so the march grew and became less than the militant proposition that had been expected, and yet more than the powers that be in Washington really wanted. And so they policed it. Literally, they planned for it literally like it was a military operation. It was called Operation Steep Hill. They had thousands of soldiers ready at the city's edge. They had helicopters, 19 helicopters ready to fly in. They had boxcars set up in North Carolina, flying boxcars, ready to swoop in at a moment's notice. Something like 50,000 troops on alert, ready to go, anticipating violence. There was no violence that day. I think I'm right in saying there were only 3 arrests, and that all of those were white. The government, right down to the last bit, had decided that it would intervene. And so they had a kill switch on the mic. Unbeknown to the organizers, they inserted a kill switch on the mic so that if anybody called for insurrection, they could stop the mic, and they planned to play Mahalia Jackson singing "He's Got the Whole World in His Hands." Just to calm them down. You know, black people, they love a good gospel. So that was the plan. As I said, it had never been done before, this. And so on the morning they woke up, Bayard Rustin goes out at dawn, he goes to the mall, and there's Rustin, there's some of his staff, and there are reporters. And the reporters are, first of all, very keen in a way that there would be violence. You know, they like that idea. And if anybody saw some of the Meet the Press of King being interviewed, that's all they were talking about beforehand. And, but if it wasn't going to be violent, then they would be pleased if it was just a failure. That would be interesting, because the notion of it being a success was unimaginable to them. And so they asked Rustin, what are you going to do if it's a failure? What are you going to do if nobody shows up? Because there was nobody there. It was the middle of the morning, there was nobody there. And Rustin put his hand in his pocket, very theatrical guy, and he puts his hand in his pocket, takes out a piece of paper and a watch. And he looks at the watch, he looks at the paper, and he said, gentlemen, everything is right on schedule. And it turned out later that the piece of paper was completely blank. So, and then in that morning, people start coming. They start coming. And by 10 or 11, everybody knows that this is going to be a fantastic, huge, unprecedented, amazing day. That it's the speculation is over within a few hours. And very symbolically, because that morning the leaders of the march had gone to meet congressmen and to, you know, just stop and chat. And the marchers had become impatient. A lot of them had gotten there, you know, fairly early. Their buses had come in from wherever they came in. And so they started to march. They just started. So King and Lewis and Wilkins and all of the speakers come out of Congress, and it's gone. And they are trying to keep up. They're stuck in their limousines. They can't get through because the marcher they've called has left without them. They have to jump out of their limousines and literally run to catch up. And if you look at the pictures, you will see them, and they're cleared, so it looks as though they're leading the march, but actually they're right in the middle. They never did get to the front. So this is the day. This is the day that would make the speech, and those are the politics that would create the moment. Now, the night before the speech, the night before the march, King asks for advice from his aides. And Wyatt Walker says to him, don't do the I have a dream thing. It's trite. It's cliche. You've done it too many times before. It's the first line of the book. And the truth is, he had done it many times before. He had actually delivered it in Chicago a week before. He delivered it in Detroit a few months earlier. And that year, King gave 350 speeches. He's not giving a new bespoke speech each time. Right? He is, as is described, he's cutting and pasting. He's a Baptist preacher. He's drawing in from the various refrains that he has to make a solid whole. And Wyatt T. Walker's like, we can do better than the I have a dream thing. This was also a revolutionary moment in technology, which meant that for the first time, really, something like this, all the three networks would be covering it live. Now, when Brown v. Board of Education was passed, I think 54% of Americans had TVs. By this time, it's 96%. And there's also the capacity to beam it across the world, which, given that this is the middle of the Cold War, that's huge. And so King is thinking about raising his game, how he's going to raise his game. And he has two refrains that are competing. One is the I have a dream, and the other one, which you saw there, was the cash check, which came from Clarence Jones, who wrote the draft text of the speech. And the quick story to that is that they're in Alabama, they've run this children's march, hundreds of children have been jailed, and a segregationist judge decides to up the amount of money it takes to bail them out, and the SCLC doesn't have it. Jones calls Harry Belafonte looking for advice. Belafonte says, hang on, I may know somebody, and he calls Nelson Rockefeller's guy in New York. Nelson Rockefeller's guy says, come to New York, I think I can help you out. Jones goes to New York and goes to the vault of the Rockefeller Bank. And in the vault, they count out the checks, they count out the money, not the check, they count out the cash, and they give him the cash, and they say, now you've got to sign for it. And he says, I cannot sign for this. I don't have that money. SCLC doesn't have that money. None of us have that money. And they say, look, you've got to sign for it. You can't take it out unless you sign for it, but I swear it'll be okay. And so Jones reluctantly signs for it, goes down to Birmingham, delivers the cash, comes back, and Monday at work, a messenger comes and produces the promissory note, and on it, it's stamped paid. And Jones thinks metaphorically about this, that if the will was there, America had the ability to deliver on its constitutional promises, that America could do that. And that's where the image of the promissory note, of the vaults, and all of that imagery comes from. King is wrestling with these two things, but there's one other thing that's important to understand about that time, which is that these historical figures are put on pedestals, but they are catty men. They are catty men, the leaders of this movement. And there is a real jealousy towards King, particularly from Roy Wilkins, who, among other things, calls King a political idiot. Now, the first problem that they have, or the first issue that they have, is King not going last. Because then everyone will see him as the keynote speaker. And they don't want that. And it's only when Bayard Rustin says, who wants to follow him? Okay, fair enough, so he can go last. But then there's the issue of the amount of time he should have. And Roy Wilkins says, I will cut the mic off myself if you go over time. You have the same time as we do. And so King is wrestling with these two refrains and decides to go with the cash check. So that is what's in the text. He goes to bed at 4 o'clock. He gives the text to be typed up. The next morning, he's out with everybody else, with the Congress people, then up to the stage. Throughout the day, he's worrying away at this text. Crossings out, and drawings, and all sorts of markings. He takes to the podium. I just want to describe the atmosphere when he does take to the podium, because it's the end of a long, hot day. It was 87 degrees at noon, and the humidity and the mood began to wane. This is Norman Mailer in Esquire. There was an air of subtle depression, of wistful apathy which existed in many. One felt a little of the muted disappointment which attacks a crowd in the 7th inning of a very important baseball game, when the score has gone 11-3. I don't understand any of this, but I'm hoping you do. The home team is ahead, but the tension is broken. One's concern is no longer noble. Rachel Horowitz says, I tell students today, there were no jumbotrons back then. All people could see was a speck, and they listened to it. And so King takes to the mic. He is the 16th on an official program that included the national anthem, an invocation, a prayer, a tribute to women, 2 sets of songs, and 9 other speakers. And only the Pledge of Allegiance and the benediction was to follow him. Some, anxious to make good time on their journey back, had already started leaving. Portions of the crowd had moved off to seek respite from the heat under the trees on the mall, while others dipped their feet in a reflecting pool. Those most eager for a view of the podium braved the sun under the shade of their umbrellas. King takes to the podium and he delivers the beginning of the speech pretty much as written in the text. And then, if you listen to the speech, you can hear he's winding down. He says, go back to Mississippi, go back to Alabama, go back to South Carolina. Behind him is sitting Mahalia Jackson. Now, no women intentionally spoke from the podium that day, although they did sing. Mahalia Jackson had previously sung I've Been Buked, I've Been Scorned, and they had a very strong relationship, King and Mahalia Jackson, because King would call Jackson for what he called gospel therapy. When he was on the road and he was down, he would call her and she would sing to him. And King is winding down his speech, and she shouts, she'd been in Detroit, she'd heard him do the refrain in Detroit. She shouts, tell him about the dream, Martin, tell him about the dream. And he continues, go back to your slums, northern ghettos, knowing that one day this will be resolved. And then she does it again. Tell him about the dream, Martin, tell him about the dream. And then at that point, and I'm using the words of Clarence Jones here, who wrote the draft text, King put the text to his left, and in his body language, changed from being a lecturer to a preacher. And then Jones turned to the man standing next to him and said, those people don't know it, but they're about to go to church. And then King started with, even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. At which point, Wyatt T. Walker, who'd advised him the night before not to do that, was on the mall and said, oh shit. He's using the dream. The rest, you'd think, would be history, apart from that history doesn't quite work like that. It was, most people who knew King well, or who were familiar with his speeches, will tell you that this is not their favorite speech. I haven't heard anybody who knew his speeches well who called that his favorite speech. Most will also tell you that they didn't expect that this would be the speech 50 years later that people would be talking about. That he did what he did. King delivered great speeches, and he did what he was supposed to do in that moment. He crowned the day off nicely. It was memorable, it was beautiful, but he's giving 350 speeches a year, and it's not that often that you hear of people saying, I went to see King and I thought it was terrible. You know, I thought he was really patchy. He was a great speaker. So why then do we remember this speech in this way? And if there's an argumentative heart of the book, that's the argumentative heart. The rest is kind of is description, at least at that point. Now, there are a range of things I might say, and to be brief, in the 5 years between King delivering that speech and him being assassinated, it actually almost disappears from public view. In the discussions in 64 and 65 about a Civil Rights Act in Congress and the Voting Rights Act, it's only mentioned once. The speech is only mentioned once. And there are, and there's a reason for that, which is that as the civil rights legislation comes into play, so King moves on to incorporate what he's learned and what he does to take on issues of poverty and class, uniting black and white. He develops a critique of capitalism, and he starts to talk about the Vietnam War. And as he does so, he becomes less and less popular. In 63, fairly even in terms of favorability ratings, according to Gallup. By 66, twice as many people have an unfavorable view of him as a favorable one. And if you think how much black people liked him, that's a lot of white people that don't like him. He dies in 68, supporting a garbage workers' strike in Memphis that goes wrong, where there's violence and where somebody dies, a strike for pay and conditions, as well as the civil rights struggle. And then he's assassinated. And America, I think, tries to forget him, but they can't. And so they come to remember him, I argue, in the same way that many white South Africans have come to love Mandela. Grudgingly and gratefully, retrospectively, selectively, without grace, but with considerable guile. By the time they realized that their dislike of him was spent and futile, he had created a world in which admiring him was in their own self-interest, because in short, they had no choice. But then comes the question, how are you going to remember him? Well, you can't remember him as the man, as a national treasure. If he's going to be made into a national treasure, you cannot remember him as the man who said that America is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, because arguably it still is. And if to be a national treasure you have to raise him above the fray, that's entering him into the fray. If you remember him as the man who said the government must intervene in order to alleviate poverty, then you put him front and center of American politics now. Whereas if you can remember him as what I describe as the last great moral act that America achieved, which is getting rid of codified segregation. I can't think of anything that America's done since then for which there's a consensus that I would call a great moral act. But getting rid of apartheid was a great moral act, and this was the most eloquent articulation of that moment, the moment that preceded it. Someone who stands in the middle of that tumult and says, we can do better than this. There is more for us there. Then there is something in that for everybody, particularly if people are not just prepared to remember the speech, but misremember the man and various bits that they don't like. It's a dream deeply rooted in the American dream that starts in the shadow of Lincoln and ends with the Negro spiritual, and in between pays homage to the Constitution and the Founding Fathers. So if you can't call it an unpatriotic speech. It comes on one of the left's crowning achievements, this march, this movement. It is delivered in the black vernacular of the Baptist Church. All kinds of people can own this speech. And then for conservatives, what conservatives do is they take one line, actually, that I have a dream that one day my children will not be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character, and they make that the whole speech. And they use that as a stick to bash affirmative action, to bash anything that seeks to take the legacy of racism into account. That is the part that they take and distort. Am I running out of time? Okay. So, to that extent, it's important, I think, to save that speech from those who would malign it and malign him. To save him from just that speech. Because the speech to King is a bit like MC Squared is to Einstein or the Little Red Book is to Mao. The speech and him have become so intimately intertwined that it's in a way that helps people forget his anti-war record, help them forget his anti-poverty record, help forget all the other things that he's done. But also this attempt to elide segregation and racism as though they were the same thing. That when America got rid of segregation and got rid of racism, when all that really happened is that Jim Crow had a son who didn't use cuss words, didn't have a hood, and then Jim Crow denied paternity, and so he's left us to kind of link up these genealogies, but they're still trying to roll back all of the things that were achieved in that moment. And so to save this speech and the man from the corrupting power of a certain kind of American patriotism that wraps everything in the flag until it suffocates it, and then parades the corpse around as though it's something that people should be proud of. I love the speech because it's a utopian speech. Because he stands in the middle of this disaster that is American racism and has the ability to conjure the notion of a better world, precisely because it's not practical. He could have stood up there and said, I have a 10-point plan. Legislation is on the table. Others did. Others really did that day, more or less do that. But King had a dream, and that ability to dream, that ability to imagine a better world is what keeps many of us going when we look around and see how disastrous things were. Who would have imagined 50 years ago that we would be where we are with gay marriage and gay rights and so on in this country now? Who knows where we might be in 50 years' time? And that could be worse or it could be better, but it gives us the ability to dream, and the ability to dream means that we have something to wake up for every morning. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Thanks so much for that, Gary. I'm going to call all of our panelists up now. And I'm going to ask all of you to maybe bring up your chairs a little bit, if that's okay. Yeah, great. Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce our panel who will be in conversation with Gary now. Amisha Patel, I'm going to go from your right to left. So Amisha Patel, she is the executive director of the Grassroots Collaborative, and she is a powerhouse of a community organizer. Then we have Toussaint Lousier, or should I say Dr. Lousier. He just successfully defended his dissertation last week. He is also an organizer with the Chicago Anti-Eviction Campaign and an organizer with the Chicago Anti-Eviction Campaign. And then we have Salim Muakil, who is a writer, and he is also a radio host at WVON. You can listen to his show on Wednesday and Saturday evenings at 7 p.m. And we have Imani Smith, who is a 2013 Freedom Fellow with the Chicago Freedom School, which is an amazing organization whose mission is to create new generations of critical and independent thinking young people, and of course, Gary. So I'm going to hand the mic over to him.
Thank you. Well, I want to start with Salim, because Salim is the one person on the panel who was actually there that day. And I'd just like to know from you, Salim, what are your memories? What brought you there? And did you think at the time that it was going to be the occasion that it was? Here you go.
Ho, there it is. Good evening, everybody. How you doing? That was I really enjoyed that, Gary. It was a very interesting and unique take on that speech. Yeah, I was there in '63. I was 16. I didn't go there for the civil rights occasion. I went there for the co-eds. They were coveted, the co-eds were what we wanted. And so we went to Washington, D.C. that day because we heard that there would be thousands of delightful co-eds available. And those rumors were absolutely correct. So I really didn't get too involved in the ceremony, and I didn't really hear the King's speech. But I was there, and I claim it. No, but so, Gary pointed to something that was a kind of the characteristic of our participation, and that was we were children of Malcolm. We wanted to overcome yesterday. We didn't want to overcome someday. And we looked at the civil rights movement as a little bit too agrarian, I guess you can say. We called it country. It was too country for us. The spirituals, the moaning, the sartorial affect, the overalls, all of that was, averse to our sensibility. We were urban guys, and so the only reason that I wanted to go to this thing was because of the women that were available. But when I got there and I saw the passion and the commitment of the folks, and even the young people who we were seeking, they were on to something else. They were really interested and committed. And that turned me around a little bit, so I kind of stumbled into the civil rights movement.
Interesting. I mean, not least because, and I heard the audience groan when you said, like, you didn't hear King, but like that's how history works, right? I mean, it's a historic speech now, but in '63, it's a old man talking on a hot day. If you're 16 and you're looking for co-eds, which is American for women, I think, right? Amina, how do you understand how the march and the speech is understood?
How do I understand the march?
Or the speech now, how it's understood, its relevance to your work in Grassroots Collaborative. What does it mean to you?
I mean, I think the theme of the march being jobs and freedom is very much what's relevant today. In Chicago and across the country, when you look at the state of communities of color, in particular, African American and Latino communities, it's very much, jobs and freedom, right? It's about poverty, it's about segregation still in the city, immigration, it's about who has access to what resources, where resources are continuing to be pulled towards and pulled away from. I think it's very much still relevant. Unfortunately, 50 years later, it's the themes that they talked about, the goals of the march, the goals were around wages, right? Still completely relevant. The goals were about sort of basic, sort of ending of discrimination, still very much when you look at Trayvon and profiling and everything. The goals are completely still pretty much exactly what is, though segregation is no longer legal, the way it's manifested still in the city and across the country, and in particular in urban communities and low-income communities, it's very much still the issues that people are organizing around, coming together, building coalitions around, strategizing around, very much in the same light of the March on Washington.
But do you find, because segregation is no longer legal, because the signs are down and so on, and this is to you or anybody else on the panel, do you find that makes your targets in some ways more elusive, that it, in the absence of a hood and a burning cross, the challenge of making people see, look, these school closings or whatever it is, this is racially problematic, becomes a tougher sell, or no?
Well, I think the fact that this panel is happening today is really timely, given it was the first day back to school for most of Chicago public schools. And, you had 30,000 children who were just displaced by the mayor's closing of 50 schools across the city. And a resistance to that, to both with the teachers' strike and then also with the school closings. I actually think that it's becoming much more clear. I think there certainly was a period of time where you could easily say, post-Obama, we're in a post-racial society, it's different. I think in Chicago, it's becoming the mayor is making it much clearer, and communities get it, right? And the organizing people are very clear about what's at stake and what's happening across the city, especially when it comes to education.
Imani, do you feel that the things have been brought into sharp relief by this moment, that the racial division is clearer?
Can you hear me? Everybody?
Can you hear?
Yeah, I hear.
Just saying that the racism has become clearer as, say in Chicago, they've pursued certain policies that have affected black and Latino people so much more disproportionately that even though they say, well, it's not racist, it's just about the number of people in the schools, it's pretty clear to people that it is. Do you feel that's the case?
I think it is pretty racist, although they do try to like sugarcoat it and say like, oh, well, we have to do this, or this is what has to be done. But the bottom line is there are hundreds and thousands of young black and Latino students who need an education, that were getting an education, and it's kind of gone awry. Like now they have to find new schools and with new people. And I know, especially for like, as far as people, I know it's dangerous as far as moving to schools and stuff. So they can't really say it's not racist. It's very much racial, and in a way, you know, gang affiliated and things like that. It affects us as racists.
And how do you, when you look back at the speech and the March on Washington and all that kind of black and white TV footage, what kind of relevance then does that have to you when you're dealing with the kind of racism that you just described?
Well, similar to, I'm sorry, I forgot your name.
Salim.
Similar to Salim, I felt a way when I first began watching Martin Luther King speeches. I am only 16, but like as a child, of course, I thought nothing of it. It's like you just going to school, it's Martin Luther King Day, we're gonna watch this. But, but as I get older and as I pay attention to the world around me, I do see the problems going on, and it makes me proud of who I am and where I am right now, like as far as being up here and being with the Freedom School and being able to fight for the things that are wrong, such as things in fair and just schools racially. So it doesn't really put me in a displacement. It just lets me know that I need to do more to help the youth so that we have a voice, so that they know that we deserve our own rights.
Right. Tusa, how does the speech, the movement, the memory, how does it inform, misinform the kind of work that you do? Is it even relevant? I mean, not to you, but to, you know, to your work, to your movement.
Sure. So I organize with a group called the Chicago Anti-Eviction Campaign. And just speaking a bit to the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, every Martin Luther King Day, right? In January, we, I think for the past 3 years, have done, taken the sort of day of service idea and used it as an opportunity to have volunteers join us, going out into the neighborhoods, many of the same neighborhoods where the schools are closing and what have you, on the south side, on the west side in particular, and reach out to homeowners and tenants that are going through foreclosure. And part of the idea is, you know, it's kind of ironic that, you know, King is somebody who, for whatever you say about, you know, and whatever the criticism that Malcolm and other folks kind of, you know, put towards him, he was a man of action, right? He was a militant, even if it was in terms of nonviolence. And it's kind of funny that with the Martin Luther King Day holiday, it's watered down to the degree where it's like, okay, it's a day of service. You go out, you paint you paint an auditorium, or you like feed, you know, you feed people like meals or something like that. But it's not necessarily in terms of organizing. It's not necessarily in terms of action and doing what you mentioned earlier in terms of raising that, kind of like heightening the contradictions, right? And creating some sort of confrontation. And that's just a small little part that we do to try and push a little bit against the way in which King, not necessarily his speech, but the sort of legacy of that aspect of the civil rights movement is misremembered. Because there's so many ways in which people in this country are taken advantage of because we don't know our own history, right? And we don't remember it properly. And I think one of the things that's complicated about that speech is it's a powerful speech if you listen to it. I know, and I've heard you speak over the past couple days about how people don't usually listen to it, right? And don't actually hear the full text of the speech and kind of have an opportunity to hone in on some of the messages and the pieces that are in it.
Because one of the things that's, I think, most unfortunate is this was, as you said earlier, this was a moment where the movement was really surging forward, and it was surging forward in a lot of ways past the leadership, past folks like King and Wilkins and what have you, and it was also at a moment where the federal government was cracking down on the movement. And in many instances, the federal government under Kennedy was so concerned about the threat of rebellion, right, from Dixiecrats, from people like Wallace, Governor Wallace, that it was not only pushing for the civil rights movement to slow down, but you didn't play it, but John Lewis's speech, the president of the chairman of SNCC, when he got up, he spoke about the fact that there were 9 civil rights workers from Albany, who were in Albany, Georgia, who were working in Albany, Georgia, who were under a federal indictment at the time, right? It's not that Governor Wallace was under indictment. It's not that Bull Connor was under indictment. It was civil rights workers who were actually being indicted by the federal government. And what the March on Washington was supposed to be was really an effort to push the federal government forward and really, kind of force its hand, and it didn't happen, right? It's not that the March on Washington actually created pressure in terms of passing that civil rights legislation. A couple weeks after the March on Washington, you got the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, right, in Birmingham, Alabama. Not too long after that, you got Kennedy's assassination. It's really in the moment after Kennedy's assassination that Johnson says, well, the best way we can honor Kennedy's legacy is by passing the Civil Rights Bill. And we sort of had this moment since King's assassination where King, a man who was hounded by the federal government in many different ways, has been kind of not just canonized, but is made sort of a national saint. And I think at the same time that's happened and kids have gotten days off of school and we have opportunities to kind of try and more clearly remember what the movement and what was actually happening at that time, a lot of the fierce urgency of now, right, that King was so much about and really had to assert to keep up with the way in which the masses of people at that time were moving, that fierce urgency has been undercut in a lot of ways, right? And so it's shocking to see this sort of commemoration of the March on Washington, and there's really hardly any reference to, the new Jim Crow, right? You have a March on Washington for jobs and freedom, and there's little discussion of the fact that there's 2 million people who are incarcerated in this country, 7 million or so who are under some form of state supervision, right? Who are living various different facets of unfreedom. And I think it's one of the contradictions, it's one of the dynamics that we have to wrestle with in the way that we have an opportunity to kind of remember this speech and understand what this speech was about, but in a lot of different ways, the movement aspect of it has been so undercut and is missing at a moment when it's vitally needed.
So taking that on, and this one I'm just going to throw out to any of you, because when Trayvon Martin, when George Zimmerman was acquitted, Mr. Crump, the family lawyer, he said he'll go down in history like Emmett Till and Medgar Evers. But the difference was when Till and Evers were murdered, there was a movement that could channel the frustration and the anger, and there was also definite goals in terms of getting rid of codified segregation. And from what I've seen, and I certainly saw this at the march in Washington on Saturday, but elsewhere, that in this moment, because racism is kind of is systemic as opposed to just systematic, it's in every element of our institutions. So some people are calling for an end to stop and frisk, some people are calling for a repeal of stand your ground. There's a range of things that one might call for. And so there is this, and this is not just about civil rights, one could just as easily say this about the Occupy movement. There is a kind of homelessness to our politics, a kind of a general anger that can't quite find its target. And I'm wondering if any of you think that's true, if you have any ideas about what we might do about that, if in any way you think that's been mischaracterized, how that does or doesn't play out in your work. Anyone?
You know, those of us from that generation always look at these explosions of interest and these spasms of public concern with great anticipation that this may be the new movement. The social pendulum, political pendulum may be swinging back to the left. And we've been disappointed frequently. I think the last time it seemed that there was great hope was after Gina, Louisiana, when there was a massive movement to respond to the criminal injustice of a situation down there, and that soon petered out. One of the reasons it petered out, of course, was because of the campaign of Barack Obama kind of siphoned a lot of that activist energy into the campaign for the first black president. And I think that in a lot of ways, ironically, has demobilized a lot of the activist energy that we may have, that may have been ignited even more so after the Trayvon Martin situation and after the stop and frisk fiasco in New York and after the judge ruled that it was a violation of the 4th and 14th Amendment. There's always hope that these new incidents will spark some sort of movement, but I'm not sure that it will be sufficient.
Anyone else before I open it up to the audience?
I mean, I think that there's moments that are really interesting. I think that I do feel like there are things, like as we get sharper about our political analysis about what's going on and why things are the way they are, things start to move towards the left. And I'd say, like, I think that some of the things that in some of the speeches, even from the civil rights movement, there was so much political education in those speeches, right? And there were very radical things that were being said, ways that people could understand and relate to that really could, like, you left feeling like there was a shift in an understanding of what was at play, understanding more of what the roots of what was going on. And I think that is one of the things that's been really hard to keep up with as as sort of the ways that oppression hits us has become harder to see, less kind of in your face. But I do think there's really good work of organizations and people trying to bring it back to that political education, because in the absence of it, there is no movement, right? Like, there is no context for the framework of what we're up against and then solutions then to take it on, right? Our solutions fall short in the absence of it. And I think that though things, so I think the question of sustainability is always the one that we grapple with in organizing, but I think there are some moments of hope that are, again, localized for me in Chicago around how people are understanding what's at the root of what's going on. When you talk about, even something like tax increment financing and TIFs that became, a few years ago was like, what is that? And now people actually understand that a bit more. They understand when you talk about the banks are stealing our homes and now they're coming after our schools, people get that. It's not, like people, there's starting to become, I think, an analysis around what's at play and then therefore the solutions to take on to address it. That does give me hope, that I think is what we need to absolutely build upon. But the question of how do we get that to scale to be able to really shift things in a long-term way is a real question that we, I think, always struggle with.
Yeah, I just want to ask one question. How many people went to marches calling for justice for Trayvon Martin? It's like a little bit of an older crowd, but okay. So I think one of the key questions that sort of follows up, not trying to be rude, it just is, right? But one of the key questions that I think is worth asking is like, why did, and I include myself in this because I raised my hand too, is like, why did we stop marching? Right? It's not like justice was achieved. It's not like any sort of resolution that folks were satisfied with came about. Well, why did we stop marching? And I think that is one of the questions that needs to be wrestled with in this particular moment, because you referenced Gramsci earlier, and Gramsci talks a fair amount, not just, especially in like countries like the United States, that you have this problem of ideology, right? And that part of the thing that we have to overcome is the fact that the status quo in places like ours gets solidified to such a degree where people kind of just take things for sort of, this is the way things are, right? And that struggles that folks are waging have to do exactly what sort of Amisha is talking about in terms of not just like fighting to win, outcomes and, small victories and things of that nature, but really shift the common sense that's kind of like solidified and kind of makes, an event like what happened with Trayvon Martin a sort of like everyday common sense or an everyday sort of common occurrence where people are like, well, it's kind of a messed up situation, but you look at his cell phone and he had pictures of himself like, doing thuggish things, right? And so it doesn't, it's kind of understandable, right? That somebody like George Zimmerman, to the degree that if George Zimmerman were a police officer, Trayvon Martin's death would be passed over, right? How many young men, how many young black men in Chicago were shot by the police and there's no outcry, right? And it's just it's somewhat different because it's Trayvon Martin, and it's really somewhat different because there was actually motion behind his particular case that really moved his case forward and made people really start to think. And I think part of what, there's a variety of diffuse issues, there's a variety of different ways that people can wrestle with the circumstances as they are right now. But I think finding ways to cut against kind of the common sense that's been ingrained in people and the way that the circumstances as they are have been kind of made to appear as if this is just gravity, this is the way things are, is the sort of work that's really, really important.
I totally agree. I do think the question is, why do we stop marching? But I think more so the question is, why are we afraid? Because if you think about it, when we look back as far as marches and protests, like in the civil rights movement, you see dog attacks and people are spit on and people are beat and put in jail. So I think the question really is, why are we afraid to fight back? Why are we afraid to say that this is wrong, that this happened? So my goal would be that more people come together and try to fight together rather than like leaving it to one person. Because Al Sharpton doesn't represent all of us. Jesse Jackson doesn't represent all of us. We all have our own voices and we can all voice them and fight for what we believe in.
Quite. Salim.
Just complicating the matter as well as a bit is the fact that I know a lot of, I have a radio program, and many callers, call up very angry and express pretty much the same kind of sentiment that people like Zimmerman express. And they've even taken to calling a lot of young black men urban terrorists and whatnot. And this is in our own communities. And so I think it's very important to be clear on the context of how, and especially how crime has influenced much of our political posture of late. And we need to pay more attention to that, I think.
I'm now going to open it up to the audience if anybody wants to ask a question. Of course, there may be several people who want to ask questions, so try and keep it as brief as you can. If it's for someone in particular, then please let them know. So come forward to the
We're going to
mic
ask you to
here.
come up to the mic to ask your question, but before I do that, I just want to make sure everyone knows that we have Gary's book for sale right over there by Haymarket Books, and we also have a reception. Gary will be signing books after the Q&A, and we have a lovely reception for all of you. And now I just want to call up Miriam Kaba, who's going to make a few announcements. Yep, thanks.
Hi, everybody. Sorry. Thanks for coming out today on a Monday. This is amazing. I just wanted to make a couple of announcements that people wanted to have made. One is that on Friday, the 30th, at the Chicago Jazz Festival at Millennium Park, somebody named Wadadi Leo Smith will be doing a tribute to 10 Freedom Summers, 1958 to 1968. and with a special composition dedicated to the March on Washington. So people want you to go out to that at 7:30 at Millennium Park. On the 18th of September, from 6 to 8:30, information is out there on the table. Radley Balco will be in town talking about the rise of the warrior cop, so talking about kind of the militarization of the police, and this is particularly important here in Chicago. Finally, I wanted to make a statement about, not a statement, an announcement about the Critical Ethnic Studies Conference, which I don't know if anybody is aware of. It's going to be here. It's a national conference at UIC from the 19th to the 21st, and it's going to be great. So people should come out and join in and continue these kinds of conversations so that we can continue to build together. Thank you. Question?
Hi, my name is Hunter Adams III, and I want to thank you, Gary, for an outstanding presentation. I just have a quick comment, and maybe you and perhaps Salim or anybody else. Harold Cruz, in The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, came out in 1967, had I don't want to say a scathing critique of a lot of people, in fact. How would you see where his critique would fit today, given the reenactment or the commemoration of the march Saturday and the continuation upcoming this Wednesday?
Does anyone want to answer that?
Well, Cruz began as a communist, and he became disenchanted with the left and became much more interested in kind of a cultural nationalism.
Right.
And so he would have viewed this, all of what's going on, a lot of our current political activity as kind of irrelevant and skirting over the primary issues that we need to deal with, and that is cultural reformation and a kind of solidarity in the African American community. So I think he would have been pretty critical of this march, and especially how it has been kind of obsequious when it comes to the president himself. He would have taken a very critical stance, I believe, against President Obama.
I mean, I'll be honest, I'm not familiar with, I know the book exists, and I have not read it. I would say this, though, about the what looks to me like the state of the Black American intellectual, and it's quite specific to America, which is that there is a way now, which wasn't even true 5 or 6 years ago, where if you're smart and you can perform it right, you could get a TV show. This is not insignificant. You could, and if you take it back 30 years, you could get a chair at a university, you could get a fellowship, that there is money out there for one or two if you're prepared to position yourself in a certain way. And that, particularly with the advent of Obama, I feel like there has been a real problem among black intellectuals about a kind of an inability or a reluctance, not an inability, because they can do it with others, to challenge power. That the moment that Obama goes from being a candidate to being the president, then the badge that says hope becomes the badge that says power, right? He's a powerful man. And the breaks that he is given. And I understand that this is partly because of the opposition in Congress, the racism that he faces and so on. But the refusal of a section of the black commentariat, which isn't necessarily the same as black intellectuals, to hold him to task for his job, I think is quite unacceptable and a bit pathetic, actually. It's not a problem for us in England because we're not going to have a black prime minister anytime soon. So, but
I live there.
but it's some of the formulations that come out in response, like he's not just the president for black people, he's the president for all Americans. And I think that black people are among all Americans. That's not a problem. You should, black people are treating him somehow like he's not president, you know, like he's their own president. I think we should demand of him what we demand of any president. And I think that somewhere in the pipeline there has been this, an embrace of him which I understand, right up until the point when he's elected. And the point at which he's elected, then I think there has to be some understanding of a critical intervention that one can make that doesn't give succor to Republicans and all the rest of it, but that leaves open the room to say, well, you're not doing enough, or you should be doing this, or you should be doing that, to criticize his foreign policy, to have some critique of him. But in this moment, I feel that even a critique of him among certain black circles is considered unacceptable. The only devotion is the only thing that you can do.
There was,
and that's crippling.
yeah.
Okay.
Good evening. Thank you for having this event. I have to say this was the first time I've seen the speech in its entirety, and I thought that was very interesting, very useful. I work in the Board of Trade Building, so I was across the street from the Occupy protesters. I saw them every day. And I liked what you said about that our activism is kind of homeless, because I think it's a shame that that was there was such momentum and passion, but there was nowhere to direct it. And then there were some arrests, and this one woman was interviewed on TV, and she said, "Oh, I just wanted to be a part of this." And I thought, but a part of what? Why? Like, I understand the civil disobedience of the people that sat at the lunch counters. I didn't understand that. And I'm one of the 99%. I think most of us here are. And I agree something needs to be done. It wasn't right what's happened with the foreclosures and you know, how the banks got a bailout, but, you know, the average citizens don't, even though it's our tax dollars that funded that bailout. So I'd like to hear what the panel has to say about how can average citizens, how could we be organized, and what could we do ultimately? I mean, it seems like with the march, there was an ultimate goal, that there was legalized segregation that needed to be ended, but 50 years later, blacks and whites still need jobs and still need a decent standard of living. So if you could speak to that, I would appreciate that.
I was at the march this past weekend, and it reminded me of many other marches that I have been to in Washington over the years. The first was in 1967 against the war in Vietnam. I quickly became an organizer of those marches, and over the years, the late 60s, early 70s, we built bigger and bigger marches. Over the years, I went to marches for gay liberation, for women's liberation, for workers' power, against the war in Afghanistan, against the war in Iraq. And we continue to need to march. But to march, we have to identify the problem. Not one of you has mentioned the magical word capitalism. Now, from my point of view, capitalism is the cause of all our social problems, including war. And until we identify that problem, until we realize that there's an alternative socialism, until we realize there's a power in our society, the working class, that when organized in its own way can challenge this system, All these different movements are going to come and go. We need a unified organization to put these things together and to start working to challenge these problems.
Hi. I was sitting here thinking, as I was listening to what you're saying, is that, well, first of all, I want to make one point. I know you mentioned that there were no women that spoke at the march, but there were women on the program to speak. And Dorothy Height was on the podium, and Myrlie Evers says that there was a physical reason why she couldn't. I think the same thing with the limos and the plane, why she couldn't be there. And I sort of only put that in context because I think it's, I sometimes think that organizing and doing this civil rights work and demanding civil social justice gets romanticized at a certain level. Like there's something that there's something more than what it really is because there are some phenomenal moments. Like I remember hearing Reverend Jackson, Jesse Jackson still talks about how people asked him, how were you able to get so close to Dr. King and to work so intimately with Dr. King? And he said, well, at the time, if you worked with King, you got shut out of every pulpit, you couldn't work anyplace else, and you lived with the threat of death every day. Line was sort of short to get to work with him. And I think that in the context of even the work that Tucson is doing with the Anti-Eviction Coalition, I think we sometimes forget that the work of organizing is every day, and it's whatever we can do. I'll just, like Mark, the man who just spoke, I want to out him. He's a librarian at the county clerk office. Boy, if you need help in trying to challenge power through the court system, he ends up helping you in his little cubicle. I think somehow it's not the big things, it's not the occupies, but it's the smaller things. It's you being the best clerk to help the poorest or the least advantaged folks, empowering those who don't have the most power. And I think organizing the march, if you take the speech and isolate it, or you take the march and isolate it, you sort of romanticize it to an unattainable point.
Anyone want to respond to any of the things that were said? I'll start from Misha.
So I'll talk a little bit about the Occupy piece and capitalism. So my organization is called Grassroots Collaborative. We work on economic and racial justice issues. The last few years, all we've worked on is revenue. We work on money. We work on capitalism. So I think what Occupy did was, yes, it actually did shift things to the left, where groups like us that have our long-term can talk about the corporate agenda and not have eyes roll at us because we're so fringe. But it's actually became common vernacular to talk about actually sort of where is the money going, who's getting it, who's benefiting it. The fact that the budget crisis is not really a budget crisis, it's just the money is all going to fewer and fewer hands. I think there is a shift in how we can talk about and organize around the things that are actually at play, that are the fundamental roots of that so much of everything else is built upon. And I do think that, and I think grassroots leaders, everyday folks across the city understand that more and more, have always got it, and now there are places within which to actually direct the organizing. So, for example, I've got these cards here if you want to stay in touch with what the work of, you asked about how do regular folks stay in touch and stay involved. There's lots of really great work that's happening. We're actually putting on in October a meeting of 3,000 people to talk about an economic justice agenda for the city. We're calling it Take Back Chicago because it is ours to take, and it was ours in the first place. And I think there's lots of exciting efforts that people can plug into. And I think just this last piece around movements. I do think it's like revolutionary movements aren't made, right? Like we make them. It takes all of us to to make them, to figure it out, to grapple with it. Internalized oppression does a number on us. It sets us up to be incredibly hopeless, to feel like things can't change, and there's a reason for that feeling to be set up in us. That I think there's lots to work to do to actually counter against that, to continue to figure out, just like the march. I mean, the march was what people made it. People came together to make it, and the question for us, I think, is what are we going to make together? How do we build upon that legacy, but build upon the work that's happening across the city already, across the country, and continue to and to make it ours? And I think there's actually a tremendous amount that's possible, and it's a struggle.
I agree that capitalism is at the root of many of our problems, and one of the reasons that it's not diagnosed as such is because the capitalists have been very deliberate in trying to convince us otherwise, and they've been very successful in doing this, even deliberately. I mean, after there was a deliberate attempt in 1971 to begin to develop think tanks. Develop ideologies that entrance the people in certain ways, and they've been successful in doing that. And I think as someone trying to develop an alternative, as people trying to develop an alternative, we need to invest just as much time and energy into developing think tanks of the left. We need to be much more deliberate in trying to develop some sort of ideological response to what's going on. Since the demise of communism, there's been no competition to capitalism. It's mutated into neoliberalism, and it now encompasses the entire planet. There's very little in opposition to it. And until we become more intentional in developing some ideological response to capitalism, we're going to continuously go down this road toward perdition, as they say.
Hi, my name is Scott, and I'm a community organizer with a group called Chicago Adapt that uses the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King: direct action, civil disobedience, nonviolent. Am I doing better? Pick it up? Okay. Thank you. And part of the problems that I think that our movement has, and I think that a lot of movements have, is not just finding that solidarity, but finding that sales pitch. When King, and I'm paraphrasing, said that what impacts one impacts all, it's really hard to sell that. It's really hard for people to understand that this isn't just something that's, because it's not in your backyard, that it doesn't impact you. So when we're talking about Trayvon, well, it's just an African-American issue. Well, no, it's not. This is something that impacts everybody. And I guess for the disabled movement in looking for our civil rights, how do you sell this to other people, and how does our movements come together as one? And I guess that's my question.
You may want to pull it down now.
I'd like to go ahead. Oh, hi. Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think that Dr. King would be outraged by the fact that children in Chicago cannot travel more than a few blocks from their homes without being afraid. And that does so much to the intellectual capacity of young people, because when I was in school in 1963, I was 11, and they started doing the same thing with the school districts that they're doing now, to great harm to our communities. And then they built the projects, they tore down the projects, and there was no plan B to help people to cope. And so everyone's afraid, and we need to do outreach, everyone, not just one teaching one, because you know what gangs do? They do outreach, and they get people's minds. One of my favorite things I remember, I loved Dr. King, I loved that speech when I was 11, but I loved the way the Black Panthers said, raise your consciousness. We have to get in these neighborhoods and raise these children's consciousness, and nobody's going to do it but us. And we can use art to do it, because Jesus used parables. That was storytelling. We can use art, poetry, all of that. That's all I had to say.
Hi, my name's Stella. I'm an organizer in Chicago and also part of the International Socialist Organization. And so I didn't really have a question. I just kind of wanted to make a comment on a lot of the questions of like how do we move forward in places like Chicago. And there's a lot of really great work being done. So I think it's not so much, to address the gentleman's question, it's not so much how do you sell your struggle to some other group. I think it's about understanding how solidarity works. And I think we're beginning to see that in Chicago, specifically because Chicago is at the center of a lot of the austerity programs. They're rolled out here. We're the experiment city. So what happens here, they tweak it and take it to other cities. Philadelphia, school closings there are devastating as well. And so in Chicago, we are seeing a lot of movements coming together to fight austerity. And when you identify austerity as the thing that's oppressing people in the city, workers, students, minorities, you begin to identify, peel back the layers and see that, as the gentleman said, capitalism is at the root of the oppression and exploitation that we experience in America today. And once you've identified capitalism and austerity as being the enemy, as being what's on the other side of us, and what we need to tackle in order to gain freedom and liberation, then that solidarity starts to happen organically, and it's not manufactured. So. For example, a couple months back, the students in Chicago, high school students who are now known as the Chicago Student Union, they boycotted, they walked out of school in protest of school closures. They were calling for a moratorium on school closures. That same day, low-wage workers across the city were striking. As soon as the students finished their press conference and heard about the low-wage workers striking, they joined their struggle. There was no question of like, oh, well, we're students, they're workers, like, that's not my issue. Students understood that that's the world that they're going to inherit once they're out of high school, because the job market is now largely low-wage workers. And so this solidarity starts to become organic, and people start to see in each other allies and people to stand with and fight back. So I think Chicago is a great example of what can happen in the country, and we're seeing a lot of movement. So I'd say, just keep your eyes peeled and go out and support all of the struggles that are happening in the city.
Hello, I'm Diana Kakoma. I run a website here in Chicago called African Chicago, and my question is directed mostly at Mr. Young or Mr. Yonge, I'm not quite sure how you say your name, but you did speak to the fact that around the time of the speech there had been technological advancements that allowed the speech to be, I guess, broadcasted or shared internationally. And you also spoke about the African independence movements and their juxtaposition to the speech. And so I was wondering if you could speak more about the international impact of the speech itself. Thank you.
So I'll start, and then we'll go around, and then we'll all have a drink, I think. There's a couple of ways in which the speech had a real international impact. The first was that it happened during the Cold War, and I didn't go into that, but that Kennedy, in particular, and America in general, was roaming the world, lecturing the world about democracy, and here suddenly were these images of houses and dogs and so on being beamed to people in the Soviet Union and people elsewhere. And they were saying, why are you trying to export something that you can't grow at home? This made front page news of Pravda and in China and elsewhere. Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State at the time, comes back to Kennedy and he says, our friends are embarrassed, our enemies are gleeful. And so it's a real embarrassment to America in terms of its Cold War position. And related to that, because these countries are becoming independent and they're looking who will they ally themselves with. Will they be non-aligned? Will they ally themselves with the Soviet Union? Will they ally themselves with America? America is looking, like I said, like this slum on the wrong side of history. And So the speech resonates throughout the black diaspora because everybody's more or less fighting for the same thing: citizenship, dignity, the vote, ownership. But it also is part of a feedback loop. I mean, America is by no means leading this wave. If anything, it was Ghana who was leading that wave. And so Black America finds itself in the middle of a global conversation. Not leading it particularly, certainly not behind it, but in the middle of a global conversation where it can find solidarity, real solidarity with other people in a way that isn't quite the case now. Because you've had now coming on for 13 years where in one form or another a black American has been the representative of America's foreign policy. Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, Obama, and these have not been great years for American foreign policy. And so Black America is now no longer just understood as a dissident force in America, it's also understood as a reliable representative of American power. So it could be Muhammad Ali, but it could be the guy with the kill list. It could be the person who's arguing for the Iraq war at the UN and so on. So there's been a real shift since that time. But at that time, Black America was in the middle of a conversation that was amplified by technology. Imani.
So the questions I would like to address as far as this woman right here in the green said it about people are so proud to be a part of something, but what are they really a part of? I think that's a great question because anybody can get out and say, oh, I'm upset at this, I don't like this, but what are you mad at? What are you really gonna do to help it? And the woman, I can't see her, but with the Chicago Students Union, I was really happy to hear her speak because being with the Freedom School, we have two cohorts. We have a Fair and Just Schools cohort and a Healthy Communities, and I myself am in the Fair and Just Schools cohort. And one of the things we did was someone from the Chicago Student Union named Pilar came up and told us many of the protests they did, and that was actually one of the things she talked about. So I think it's very easy to stand up and join a group and fight for what you believe in. It's not as difficult as people make it seem. So I was very happy to hear those questions because I'm trying to say it right. So, I think as long as I think the bottom line is as long as you know what you want to see change, you can pretty much go out anywhere and make that change. I don't think it's much of a discussion like, do we really want it? Are we gonna do it? If you feel a way about it, you should do it. And you should find someone else who wants to do it and do it. So.
Two things. I think that the threat of communism was a spur to the United States to be much more forthcoming in the way it dealt with African Americans and other minority groups in this country because it was getting a bad rep and capitalism was looking bad when it came to anti-racist policies. And the other thing is, Gary pointed out that African Americans used to be considered kind of honorary members of the third world. And when I can speak to that personally because when I was in the service, I did some TDY in Thailand. This was during the Vietnam conflict when most of the Thais in this particular neighborhood were very, very favorable toward the Viet Cong and the Khmer Rouge. And we were accepted as if we were members of the club. White GIs could not come anywhere close to this neighborhood. And so I in my early years, got an understanding of how we were seen as comrades in the revolutionary struggle around the world. And as Gary pointed out, we are no longer seen that way because of folks like Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, and Mr. Drone himself, Barack Obama. Thank you.
Just real quickly, wanted to add on to the piece about solidarity. This coming Wednesday, there's actually been another call for a school boycott on behalf of the Chicago Student Union and other organizations. And one of the they're going to be marshaling at around noon in front of the Chicago School Board's headquarters. And that's actually the same day that there's a citywide demonstration taking place downtown against police murders. So actually calling attention to the number of people who have been shot and killed by Chicago police officers, and there's been no prosecution. There's been no or either persecution or prosecution. In many instances, there's been very little disciplining of police officers who have killed people. And these are not simply the instances of urban terrorists like folks who call into Salim's show reference, but these are people like Rekia Boyd, right? Somebody who was in the park late at night, not as late as some of the Occupy folks were, but in the park enjoying herself in an evening, and a police officer who's been drinking off duty shoots her in the head, right? Gets into a disagreement with her and another person that she's with and shoots her in the head, right? And this is an issue that's been going on for some time, and I think because of the sort of urban terrorist label, it's one that's kind of allowed to sort of pass without any real kind of critical analysis, because it's just sort of an assumption that these are people whose claim, right, not just the sort of civil rights and human rights, but the life in some instances is kind of shaky. And so a number of groups have been mobilizing around this issue, and they're going to have a march at the same time as the Chicago Student Union's school boycott, and they're going to bring both of those demonstrations together, right, in terms of recognizing the connection between those issues and recognizing it in a way that highlights some of the ongoing issues of violence that get talked about with very little sort of systemic analysis. So I wanted to say that, right? But I also wanted to caution just a little bit against, I think, what both of you all pointed out in terms of the importance of the Cold War context, right? And that also speaks to some of the suspicion that people like J. Edgar Hoover had that the civil rights movement was sort of a communist-inspired movement, right? And, you know, kind of using that as a justification to wiretap King and wiretap a number of his aides and associates, that international context was very important. Obviously, the local mobilizing, the local organizing context was really important. And just two quick points. One, that if we think about the March on Washington, right, as being kind of a kind of fulfillment of what A. Philip Randolph was trying to do in 1941 when he called for a March on Washington to desegregate the Army, to desegregate the armed forces, to desegregate in particular the defense industries, right? Where coming out of the Depression, so many people actually had an opportunity to get jobs, particularly men and then later women as the war gets started. That by and large, black folks were barred from that. And that was really the goal of the March on Washington movement that Randolph and Rustin were involved in back in 1941, and then 22 years later have an opportunity to really make good on the threat that they had promised. And if you look at what King was able to do on that day as being sort of a culmination of 20 years of struggle, and if you think about Randolph in particular, his starting the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in 1925, this is to be able to get to a moment like this, and I think we can be very cynical about where we are today, and in some instances, not cynicism, but some realism as well, you know, is important, that it's really, and this kind of goes to your point a little bit, it's really those people who sort of set their vision on the long term, right? And we're like, we're going to play the long game, and I'm going to be in this for the next 2 decades. It's really those sort of folks who have been able to really at least establish the sort of platform that somebody like Martin Luther King, who was to some degree an admirer, right, and a student of A. Philip Randolph, was able to take advantage of. And it's really that long vision and those people who were in it, not just for the 100-meter dash, but for the, the marathon, who are really able to bring about the kind of moments that we, we'll sit back and remember and sort of critique and kind of hum and awe about years later on. So, yeah, I just wanted to add to that.
Amisha.
Yeah, I mean, I think this piece around, I think what folks, Imani and Toussaint said around solidarity is really important, that I think the idea of one, being able to recognize that your struggles with somebody else, like, is this beginning point, but that solidarity is actually actionable, right? Like, it's about doing something with that knowledge. So what does that actually look like to do something in solidarity with somebody? But then I also think it's about how do we push ourselves to be uncomfortable. I think none of us, we're so used to being comfortable, and I think especially middle class folks want to stay comfortable. And I think we're not going to get there unless we need to, unless we push on that place of privilege or where that comfort, that sort of comfort allows. So what would be uncomfortable for each of us, right, in terms of seeing our struggle with somebody else? What would it take to actually do something around that? I think there's all individual acts that add up to something significant, and then I do think it is about how do we have wins and victories and things that we point to as we fight for the long haul, right? And I think there's both the urgency of now, but the fact that this didn't also just happen to us overnight. So what it takes to actually unravel and dismantle, decolonize our own minds as we work to decolonize our communities, this happens over the long term, and is absolutely about challenging our own places where we're comfortable, challenging our own ideas and conceptions about sort of what's at the root of what's going on, and trying things. I think we can't be afraid to fail. We can't be afraid to fuck up. We have to just try things, see what sticks, learn, and actually continue to keep staying in the fight, whichever way we can.
I mean, if there's one thing to bear in mind as we wrap up here, it's that they didn't know it was going to be historic when they did it. They didn't know 50 years from now that we would be talking about it. They didn't even know that it was going to work. On the morning, they didn't even know if anyone was going to show up. So history is made by people who show up, and without any guarantees of victory. I think decolonizing your minds and decolonizing your communities is a very good place to end. So I'd like to thank Amisha, Toussaint, Salim, Imani. I'd like to thank you, the audience. Have a drink, buy a book, and I'll see you in a minute. Take care.